The first time I saw Led Zeppelin was in 1973. They came straight out and into rock and roll, bang, and hit you right between the eyes. John Bonham was living up to his reputation as rock's most powerful drummer. Jimmy Page was duck walking across the stage, firing out these incendiary guitar lines. And Robert Plant, let's be honest, probably didn't require any amplification at all on that colossal voice. Stage left was John Paul Jones, playing bass, slightly in the background, almost like he didn't belong there. I started to focus, to zone in on his playing, and it dawned on me how huge his contribution was to this powerhouse of a band. At times he would be holding down the rhythm, seemingly locked into Bonham's snare and bass drums, as well as mirroring perfectly Bonzo's drum fills. Then he would join Page on those classic riffs, but there was variation. At various times he would really attack those strings, adding a percussive part to underpin Page's guitar. Then he played these little improvised runs, but the genius here was he chose his notes. He kept it simple, he kept it clean, and he didn't interfere with what Page or Plant were doing, as a more busier bassist might have. Jones would also play just in front of the beat, pushing the music along, or a hair's breadth behind that beat, bit like what Keith Richards does for the Stones. Playing behind the beat gives the music swing and a kind of primal funkiness. As the concert progressed, John Paul switched to keyboards, eerie electric piano for No Quarter, mellotron and organ for Stairway to Heaven, and a killer organ solo on Thank You, all the while playing tourist bass pedals beneath those keyboards. I left the venue that night in awe of the man. John Richard Baldwin, soon to be known as John Paul Jones, was born in Sidcup, Kent on the 3rd of January 1946. He began playing piano at age 6. John's father was a pianist, a trumpet player and an arranger for big bands, as well as performing a musical comedy act with his wife, John's mother. Jones Sr. was a big fan of jazz and blues and introduced John to the likes of Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Bucka White, Big Bill Broonzy, Charles Mingus and Thelonious Monk. At an early age, Jones went to boarding school, Christ College, Blackheath, where he formally studied music. At the age of 14, he became a choir master and organist at his local church. But around this time, rock and roll was also starting to have an impact on the young prodigy. John. The first record I bought as a teenager was Jerry Lee Lewis's Great Balls of Fire and the Everly Brothers' Kathy's Clown. I also got into soul music through Ray Charles. But it was the fluid playing of Phil Upchurch on his 1961 album You Can't Sit Down that inspired John Paul to start playing the electric bass. Very quickly, Jones found himself playing for the jazz rock group the Jet Blacks, which included John McLaughlin. In 1962, less than a year after picking up the bass guitar, he was offered a place in the backing band of Jet Harris and Tony Meehan, former members of the UK group The Shadows. Meehan and Harris had left the band to form a pop duo of their own. But when the Shadows were looking for a new bassist in 1963, Tony Meehan put John Paul's name forward as a replacement. A whole lot of Apache? Maybe not. Tony then suggested to John that he should become a session musician at Decca Studios in London. Very, very quickly, producers and artists recognised John Paul's skills as a bassist and an arranger. For 4 years he was in constant demand, completing 2 to 3 sessions a day, 6 days, 7 days a week. John Paul. I was arranging 50 to 60 things a month and it was starting to kill me. A lot of the sessions John Paul can't remember, but here's a few. Arranging the string section on the Stones' She's a Rainbow. Playing bass for Cat Stevens on his debut album Matthew and Son. Dusty Springfield, her album Dusty Definitely, where as well as bass duties he conducts the orchestra. In fact, it was Dusty who put in a good word or two when her label Atlantic were thinking of signing Led Zeppelin. When Jeff Beck recorded his first solo single, Beck's Bolero, he enlisted old friend Jimmy Page as a producer and to back him up on 12-string guitar. Page brought in the rhythm section of John Paul Jones on bass and Keith Moon on drums. Someone in the studio that day suggested they form a band. Moon quipped back that would go down like a lead balloon, and they say that is the origins of the name Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page. I was working at the sessions for Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man, and John Paul Jones was looking after the musical arrangements. During a break, he asked me if I could use a bass player in the new group I was forming. He had proper music training and he had quite brilliant ideas. I just jumped at the chance of getting him. John Paul Jones says one of the reasons that Led Zeppelin was so successful was all the diverse musical influences that every member brought to the table. He says we could go folky, we could go a bit Celtic, a bit Arabic, rocky, bluesy, go in any direction we wanted because all the skills and the love of these musics were there. Back in those early days, John says he took huge amounts from the Motown bass legend James Jamerson. For those who don't know, James played on most of the Motown hits of the 1960s and 1970s. Day after day, he'd be in the studio and he'd have to come up with one great bass line after another, such as You Can't Hurry Love, the Supremes. I heard it on the grapevine, Marvin Gaye, River Deep, Mountain High, Ike and Tina Turner. Marvin Gaye was desperate to have Jamerson play on What's Going On, and he went out that night to several bars to find the bassist. When he did, he brought Jamerson to the studio, but Jamerson was too intoxicated to stay upright, so he played the classic line, the classic bass line, while lying flat on his back. Another huge influence in those early days on John Paul was Donald Duck Dunn. While James Jamerson ruled at Motown, Donald provided all those classic bass lines over at Stax for Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, and Booker T and the MGs, and many, many others. When you listen to other musicians talk about Dunn's playing, they say he plays what he thinks should be there. He doesn't stick to some bass playing manifesto. Any of this sound vaguely familiar? I can see why these two guys were such big influences, because this is what John was doing in the London studios and why he was in such great demand, week in, week out. Back in the 70s, I used to have huge arguments with other Zeppelin fans when I used to say that Zeppelin had so much funk and they could swing. John Paul Jones. Yeah, me and Bonzo were huge Motown and Stax fans and general soul music fans. James Brown, for example, which is one of the reasons I've always said that Zeppelin was one of the few bands to swing. We actually had a groove in those days. People used to come to our shows and dance, which was great. To see all the women up and dancing, it was brilliant. You didn't see that at a Black Sabbath show. So we were different in that way. We were a groovy band. We used all our black pop music influences as a key to rock that went way over the top. So let's have a look at some of the things that Jonesy brought to Led Zeppelin. Some of the magic moments, though to be fair, you could listen to any Led Zeppelin song and John Paul Jones would be making a stellar contribution. Heartbreaker from Led Zeppelin 2, and I've included the isolated bass track in the description. Just listen to the distorted, dirty tone that John gets and how that underpinned that famous guitar riff by Jimmy Page. We have to remember that Zeppelin only had 3 musicians on stage, so John as a bassist would have to work really, really hard, otherwise the sound could have come across as a bit flat. Geddy Lee said the same thing when he started out with Rush. As a bassist, he had to really fill in the sound the three-piece were making. Another isolated bass track which I'm going to include in the description is Ramble On. Now listen to how John's bass starts with those low, slow notes and transitions to adding a counter melody to the vocals, and is so damn funky. Notice also the difference in tone between the two. For Heartbreaker, John is using a pick, while with Ramble On he's finger plucking. Now we move on to Stairway to Heaven from the movie Song Remains the Same. During Jimmy's stellar guitar solo, take a listen at 7 minutes 42 seconds. John Paul enters with this wonderful marching organ riff. Bonzo falls in straight behind, and together they create these counterpoints for Jimmy just to bounce off of. Kashmir, I probably could do a whole video on just this one track. It's been, 45 years since I first heard this track, and I'm still finding out new stuff about it. Basically, the drums are in 4/4 time and the strings, bass and guitar are in 3/4 time. This creates this weird shifting rhythmic dynamic. It's like watching two dancers perform who weave separate patterns only to briefly unite and then drift apart again. It's quite simply unbelievable musicianship and playing. Live, Jonesy would sometimes lean so far back off the beat I'm surprised he didn't fall over. He says, Jimmy and I would have competitions in who could lay back most off the beat. John Paul Jones. I started playing the riff with John Bonham and we just locked in and played it non-stop. It was so infectious. It was such a delight and it was just so us. I overdubbed the electric 12 string to what would become later the brass parts. I had visualised this piece as being mighty, orchestral, even threatening. When I heard the playback of myself and the drums, I knew this was truly innovative. This was the birth of Kashmir. John Paul. The secret of successful keyboard string parts is to play only the parts that a real string section would play. That is, one line for the first violins, one line for second violins, one for violas, one for cellos, one for basses. Some divided parts, 2 or more notes to a line are allowed, but keep them to a minimum. Think melodically. No Quarter, of course, is another great favourite, and that brilliant electric piano playing, which has been lifted, stroke sampled by many bands. But the one I like the most is a track called Terminal by OSI. That's really worth a listen. Trampled Underfoot, heavy rock meets heavy funk. They say this is inspired by Stevie Wonder's Superstition, but John Paul's clarinet playing is of course extraordinary. But few talk about the bass playing on this track. It's just phenomenal. Just go and take a listen to the bass playing on Trampled Underfoot. It gets very ignored, but it is brilliant. The last one I'll leave you with is In the Evening. Check out the track around 4 minutes 20 seconds when Jimmy goes into a little bluesy solo. But take a listen to the bass playing just behind Jimmy's guitar. It's so melodic and lyrical. I'll leave the last words on this piece to Rush bassist Geddy Lee when he interviewed John Paul for his Big Beautiful Book of Bass in London. John Paul sat there fiddling around while we got ready for the interview. He then picked up a bass and played Heartbreaker, and everyone in the room stopped talking and moving. It was all about one man on his 62 Fender Jazz bass. So thanks for listening. Hope you like this video on John Paul Jones. There are a few others. There's a few other parts of his career I'd like to cover in the future, and I hope you'll stay with us for those. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stay well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.